Boccaccio's Decameron, second day, seventh story. The young ladies who were feeling very sorry for Madonna Baratola would possibly have dissolved into tears if Emilia's recital of the lady's woes had continued for very much longer. When finally the tale was finished, it was the queen's wish that Panfilo should take up the storytelling, and being very obedient, he began forthwith as follows. Delectable ladies, it is no easy matter for a man to decide what is in his best interests, for as we have often had occasion to observe, there are many who have considered that only their poverty stood between themselves and a secure, trouble-free life, and they have not only prayed to God for riches, but sought deliberately to acquire them, sparing themselves neither effort nor danger in the process. And no sooner have they succeeded than the prospect of a substantial legacy has frequently caused them to be murdered by people who, before they had become rich, had never dreamed of doing them any harm. Others have risen from low estate to the dizzying heights of kingship, through 1,000 dangerous battles, spilling the blood of their nearest and dearest as they went along, thinking sovereign power represented the peak of happiness. But as they could have seen and heard for themselves, it was happiness fraught with endless fear and worry. And at the cost of their lives, they came to realize that the chalice at the royal table may sometimes be poisoned, even though it is made of gold. Again, there have been many people who have ardently yearned for bodily strength and beauty, whilst others have longed with equal intensity for bodily ornaments, only to discover too late that the very things they so unwisely desired were the cause of their death or unhappiness. But in order not to become involved in a detailed review embracing the whole range of human desires, I will merely affirm that no man can with complete confidence elect any one of them as being wholly immune from the accidents of fortune. For if we were to proceed at all times in a correct manner, we would have to rein ourselves to the acquisition and possession of whatever has been granted to us by the one who alone knows what we need and has the power to provide it to us. However, there are many ways in which people sin through their desires, and you, gracious ladies, sin above all in one particular way, which is in your desire to be beautiful, inasmuch as, being dissatisfied with the attractions bestowed upon you by nature, you go to extraordinary lengths in trying to improve them. And therefore, I would like to tell you a story about a Saracen girl's ill-starred beauty, which, in the space of about 4 years, caused her to be newly married on 9 separate occasions. A long time ago, Babylon was ruled by a sultan called Beminadad. There was no such person. During whose reign it was unusual for anything to happen that was contrary to his wishes. Apart from numerous other children, both male and female, this man possessed a daughter called Alatil, who, at this period, according to everybody who had set eyes on her, was the most beautiful woman to be found anywhere on earth. Now, the Sultan had recently been attacked by a great horde of Arabs and inflicted a major defeat on his aggressors, receiving timely assistance from the King of Algarve. This is more or less where modern-day Morocco is, who asked the Sultan, as a special favor, to give him Alatil as his wife. The Sultan agreed, and having seen her aboard a well-armed and well-appointed ship, with a retinue of noblemen and noblewomen and a large quantity of elegant and precious accoutrements, he bade her a fond farewell. Finding the weather favorable, the ship's crew put on full sail, and for several days after leaving Alexandria, the voyage was prosperous. But one day, when they had passed Sardinia, and were looking forward to the journey's end, they ran into a series of sudden squalls, each of which was exceptionally violent, and these gave the ship such a terrible buffeting that passengers and crew were convinced time and again that the end had come. But they had plenty of spirit and by exerting all their skill and energy, they survived the onslaught of the mountainous seas for 2 whole days. However, as night approached for the 3rd time since the beginning of the storm, which showed no sign of relenting, but on the contrary was increasing in fury, they felt the ship foundering, though in fact they were not far from the coast of Majorca. They had no idea where they were, because it was a dark night and the sky was covered with thick black clouds, and hence it was impossible to estimate their position either with the ship's instruments or with the naked eye. It now became a case of every man for himself, and there was nothing for it but to launch a longboat, into which the ship's officers leapt, preferring to put their trust in it rather than in the crippled vessel. But they had no sooner abandoned ship than every man aboard followed their example and leapt into the longboat, undeterred by the fact that the earlier arrivals were fighting them off with knives in their hands. Thus, in trying to save their lives, they did exactly the opposite. For the longboat was not built for holding so many people in weather of this sort, and it sank, taking everybody with it. Meanwhile, the ship itself, though torn open and almost waterlogged, was driven swiftly by the powerful winds, until eventually it ran aground on a beach on the island of Majorca. By this time, the only people still aboard were the lady and her female attendants. They were all lying there like dead creatures, paralyzed with terror by the raging tempest. The ship's impetus was so great that it thrust its way firmly into the sand before coming to a rest, a mere stone's throw from the shore. And since the wind was no longer able to move it, there it remained for the rest of the night to be pounded by the sea. By the time it was broad daylight, the storm had abated considerably, and the lady, who was feeling practically half dead, raised her head and began, weak as she was, to call out to her servants, one after another. But it was all to no purpose, because they were too far away to hear. On receiving no response and seeing nobody about, she wondered what on earth had happened, and began to be filled with considerable alarm. She staggered to her feet to discover that her maids of honor and other women were lying about all over the ship, and she attempted to rouse each of them in turn by calling to them at the top of her voice. But few of them showed any sign of life, because they had been laid low by the terror and the heavings of their stomachs, and her own fears were accordingly increased. Nevertheless, since she was all alone and possessed no idea of her whereabouts, she felt in need of someone to talk to. And so she went round prodding the ones who were still alive and forcing them to their feet, only to discover that none of them had any idea what had happened to all the men aboard. And when they saw that the ship was aground and full of water, they all started crying as though they would burst. It was not until mid-afternoon that they were able to make their plight apparent to anybody on shore, or else in the vicinity, who would have come to their assistance. Halfway through the afternoon, in fact, a nobleman whose name was Pericone di Visalgo happened to pass that way as he was returning from one of his estates. He was riding along on horseback with several of his men, and when he saw the ship, he immediately guessed what had happened. So he ordered one of his servants to try and clamber aboard without further delay and bring him a report on how matters stood. The servant had quite a struggle, but eventually he boarded the ship, where he found the young gentlewoman, frightened out of their senses, hiding with her handful of companions in the forepeak. On seeing him, the woman burst into tears and repeatedly pleaded for mercy. But when they perceived that neither he nor they could understand what the other party was saying, they tried to explain their predicament by means of gestures. Having seized up the situation as to the best of his ability, the servant reported his finding to Pericone, who promptly arranged for the women to be brought ashore along with the most valuable of those items on the ship that could be salvaged, and escorted them all to his castle, where he restored the woman's spirits by arranging for them to be fed and rested. He could see from the richness of her apparel that he had stumbled across some great lady of quality, and he quickly gathered which of them she must be, because she was the sole center of the women's attention. The lady was pallid and extremely disheveled looking as a result of her exhausting experience at sea, But it seemed to Pericone that she possessed very fine features, and for this reason he resolved there and then that if she had no husband, he would marry her, and that if marriage proved to be out of the question, he would take her as his mistress. Pericone, who was a very powerful, vigorous-looking fellow, caused the lady to be waited upon hand and foot. When after a few days she had fully recovered, he found that she was even more beautiful than he had ever thought possible. He was greatly pained by the fact that they were unable to communicate with each other, and that he could not therefore discover who she was. Nevertheless, being immensely taken with her beauty, he behaved lovingly and agreeably towards her in an endeavor to persuade her to do his pleasure without a struggle. But it was no use. She refused to have anything to do with him, and meanwhile Pericone's ardor continued to increase. The lady had no idea where she was, but she quickly gathered from their mode of living that the people she was staying with were Christians, and she could see little purpose, even if she had known her whereabouts, in revealing her identity. From the way Pericone was behaving, she knew that sooner or later, whether she liked it or not, she would be compelled to let him have his way with her. But meanwhile, she was proudly resolved to turn a blind eye to her sorrowful predicament. To the 3 surviving members of her female retinue, she gave instructions that they should never disclose their identity to anyone until such time as they were in a position that offered them a clear prospect of freedom. Furthermore, she implored them to preserve their chastity, declaring her own determination to submit to no man's pleasure except her husband's. A sentiment that was greeted with approval by the 3 women, who said that they would do their utmost to follow her instructions. As the days passed and Pericone came into closer proximity with the object of his desires, his advances were more firmly rejected, and the flames of his passion raged correspondingly fiercer. Realizing that his flattery was getting him nowhere, he decided to fall back on ingenuity and subterfuge. Holding brute strength in reserve as a last resort. He had noticed more than once that the lady liked the taste of wine, which, since it is prohibited by her religion, she was unaccustomed to drinking, and by using this in the service of Venus, he thought it possible that she would yield to him, and so, one evening, having feigned indifference concerning the matter for which she had paraded so much distaste, he held a splendid banquet with all the trappings of a great festive occasion, at which the lady was present. The meal was noticeable for its abundance of good food, and Pericone arranged with the steward who was serving the lady to keep her well supplied with a succession of different wines. The steward carried out his instructions to the letter, and the lady, being caught off her guard and carried away by the agreeable taste of the wines, drank more than was consistent with her decorum. Forgetting all the misfortunes she had experienced, she became positively merry, and when she saw some women dancing in the Majorcan manner, she herself danced Alexandrian fashion. On seeing this, Pericone felt that he would soon obtain what he wanted, and calling for further large quantities of food and drink, he caused the banquet to continue into the small hours of the morning. Finally, when the guests had departed, he accompanied the lady, alone, into her room, without the least show of embarrassment. Being rather more flushed with wine than tempered by virtue, she then undressed in Pericone's presence, as though he were one of her maidservants, and got into bed. Pericone lost no time in following her example. Having snuffed out all the lights, he quickly scrambled in from the other side and lay down beside her. And taking her into his arms, without meeting any resistance on her part, he began to make amorous sport with her. She had no conception of the kind of horn that men do their butting with. And when she felt what was happening, it was almost as though she regretted having turned a deaf ear to Pericone's flattery, and could not see why she had waited for an invitation before spending her night so agreeably. For it was she herself who was now issuing the invitation, and she did so several times over, not in so many words, since she was unable to make herself understood, but by the way of her gestures. Great indeed was their mutual delight, but fortune, not content with converting her from a king's bride into a baron's mistress, thrust a more terrible friendship upon her. Pericone had a 25-year-old brother, fair and fresh as a garden rose, whose name was Morato. He had already seen the lady and taken an enormous liking to her, and as far as he could judge, the only thing that appeared to be standing between him and the conquest he desired to make of her was the strict watch maintained by Pericone. He therefore devised a nefarious scheme which he lost no time in pursuing to its dreadful conclusion. In the port of the town there happened that time to be a ship commanded by two young Genoese, with a full cargo for Corinth in the Peloponnesus. She was already under canvas, ready to put to sea with the first favorable wind, and Morato made an arrangement with her masters for himself and the lady to be taken aboard the following night. This done, he decided how he would have to proceed, and when it was dark, he wandered unobtrusively into his brother's house, to which he had open access, and concealed himself inside. He had meanwhile enlisted the aid of some trusted companions for his enterprise, and, in the dead of night, having let himself into the house, he led them to the place where Pericone and the woman were sleeping. Entering the room, they killed Pericone in his sleep and seized the lady, who woke up and started to cry, threatening her with death if she made any noise. Then, taking with them a considerable quantity of Pericone's most precious possessions, they departed without being heard, and made their way to the quayside, where Morato boarded the ship with the lady, leaving his companions to go their separate ways. The ship's crew, taking advantage of a strong and favorable wind, cast off and sailed swiftly away. The lady was sorely distressed by this second catastrophe, coming as it did so soon after the first, but Morato, with the heaven-sent assistance of St. Stephen in the hand, began consoling her so much, to such a good effect, that she soon returned his affection and forgot all about Pericone. She had hardly begun to feel settled, however, before fortune, not content, it seemed, with her previous handiwork, engineered yet another calamity. As we have almost grown tired of repeating, the woman had a body of an angel and a temperament to match, and the two young masters of the vessel fell so violently in love with her that they could concentrate on nothing else except how best that they might make themselves useful and agreeable to her, at the same time taking care not to let Morato see what they were up to. On discovering that they were both in love with the same woman, they talked the matter over in secret and agreed to make the lady's conquest a mutual affair, as though love were capable of being shared out like merchandise or profits. For some time their plans were thwarted because they found that Morato kept a close watch on her. But one day, when the ship was sailing along like the wind and Morato was standing on the stern facing seaward without the least suspicion of their attention, they both crept up on him, seized him quickly from behind, and hurled him into the sea. By the time anybody so much as noticed that Morato had fallen overboard, they had already sailed on for over a mile. And the lady, hearing what had happened and seeing no way of going to his rescue, began to fill the whole ship with the sounds of her latest affliction. The two gallants immediately rushed to her assistance, and with the aid of honeyed words and extravagant promises, few of which she understood, they attempted to pacify her. What she was bemoaning was not so much the loss of Morato as her own sorry plight, and so after she had listened to a stream of fine talk, repeated twice over, she seemed considerably less distraught. The two brothers then got down to a private discussion to decide which of them was to take her off to bed. Each man claimed priority over the other, and having failed to reach any agreement on the matter, they started to argue fiercely between themselves. Nor did their quarrels stop with the exchange of verbal abuse. Losing their tempers, they reached for their knives and hurled themselves furiously upon one another, and before the ship's crew could separate the pair, they had both inflicted a number of stab wounds, from which one man died instantly, while the other emerged with serious injuries to various parts of his body. The lady was sorely distressed by all this, for she could see that she was now alone on the ship with nobody to turn to for help or advice, and she was greatly afraid lest the relatives and companions of these two men should vent their rage upon her. However, partly because of the injured man's pleas on her behalf, and partly because they soon arrived at Corinth, the danger to her person was short-lived. On their arrival, she disembarked with the injured man, and went to live with them at an inn, whence the story of her great beauty spread rapidly through the city, eventually reaching the ears of the Prince of Morea, who was living in Corinth at the time. He therefore demanded to see her, and on discovering her to be more beautiful than she had been reported, he immediately fell so ardently in love with her that he could think of nothing else. When he learnt about the circumstances of her arrival in the city, he saw no reason why he should not be able to have her. And indeed, once the wounded man's relatives discovered that the prince was putting out inquiries, they promptly sent her off to him without asking any questions. The prince was highly delighted, but so also was the lady, who considered that she had now escaped from a most dangerous situation. On finding that she was endowed with the stately manners as well as beauty, the prince calculated, since he could obtain no other clue as to her identity, that she must be a woman of gentle birth, and his love for her was accordingly redoubled. And not only did he keep her in splendid style, but he treated her as though she were his wife rather than his mistress. On comparing her present circumstances with the awful experiences through which she had passed, the lady considered herself very fortunately placed. Now that she was contented and completely recovered, her beauty flourished to such a degree that the whole of the Eastern Empire seemed to talk of nothing else. And so it was that the Duke of Athens, a handsome, powerfully proportioned youth who was a friend and relative of the prince, was smitten with a desire to see her. And under the pretext of paying the prince one of his customary visits, he came with a splendid and noble retinue to Corinth, where he was received with honor amid great rejoicing. A few days later, the two men fell to conversing about this woman's beauty, and the Duke asked whether she was so marvelous an object as people claimed. "Far more so," replied the prince, "but instead of accepting my own word for it, I would rather that you judged with your own eyes." Thereupon the prince invited the Duke to follow him, and they made their way to the lady's apartments. Having been warned of their approach, she received them with great civility, her face radiant with happiness. She seated herself between the two men, but the pleasure of conversing with her was denied them because she understood little or nothing of their language. And so each man stared in fascination upon her, in particular the Duke, who was scarcely believing that she was a creature of this earth, little realizing that as he gazed at her, that he was imbibing the poison of love through the medium of his eyes, and fondly believing that he could satisfy his pleasure merely by looking at her, he was completely bowled over by her beauty and fell violently in love with her. When he and the prince had taken their leave of her, and he had an opportunity to indulge in a little quiet reflection, he came to the conclusion that the prince must be the happiest man on earth in possessing so beautiful a plaything. Many and varied were the thoughts that passed through his mind, until eventually, his blazing passion gaining the upper hand over his sense of honor, he decided that whatever the consequences, he would remove his pleasure-giving object from the prince and do all in his power to make it serve his own happiness. Being determined to move swiftly, he thrust aside all regard for reason and fair play and concentrated solely on cunning. And one day, in the furtherance of his evil designs, he made an arrangement with one of the prince's most trusted servants, Curiaci by name, to have all his horses and luggage placed secretly in readiness for a sudden departure. During the night, he and a companion, both fully armed, were silently admitted by the aforesaid Curiaci into the prince's bedroom. It was a very hot night, and although the woman was asleep, the prince was standing completely naked at the window overlooking the sea, taking advantage of a breeze that was blowing from that quarter. The Duke, having told his companion beforehand what he had to do, stole quietly across the room as far as the window, and drove a dagger into the prince's back with so much force that it passed right through his body, and catching him quickly in his arms, he hurled him out of the window. Now the palace stood very high above the sea level, and the window at which the prince had been standing overlooked a cluster of houses that had been laid in ruins by the violence of the sea. It was but rarely, if ever, that anybody went there, and consequently, as the Duke had already foreseen, no one's attention was attracted by the body of the prince as it fell. On seeing this deed accomplished, the Duke's companions quickly produced a noose that he had brought along for the purpose, and pretending to embrace Curiaci, he threw it around his neck, drew it tight so that Curiaci could not make any noise. He was then joined by the Duke, and they strangled the man before hurling him out to join his master. This done, they satisfied themselves that neither the lady nor anybody else had heard them, and then the Duke picked up a lantern, carrying it over to the bed, and silently uncovered the woman who was sleeping soundly. Having exposed her whole body, he gazed upon her with enrapt fascination, and although he had admired her when she was clothed, now that she was naked, his admiration was greater beyond all comparison. The flames of his desire burned correspondingly fiercer, and unperturbed by the crime he had just committed, he lay down at her side, his hands still dripping with blood, and made love to the woman, who was half asleep and believed him to be the prince. Eventually, after spending some time with her, he rose giddily to his feet and summoned a few of his men, whom he commanded to hold the lady in such a way that she could not make any noise. Then he conducted her through the secret door, by way of which he had entered, and having settled her on horseback with a minimum of noise, he set out with all his men in the direction of Athens. Since he was already married, however, it was not in Athens itself that he deposited this unhappiest of women, but at a very beautiful palace of his, not far from the city, overlooking the sea. Here he established her in secluded splendor and saw that she was provided with everything she needed. On the following day, the prince's courtiers had waited until the late afternoon for their master to rise from his bed. But when they still heard no sound, they pushed open his bedroom doors, which were not locked, and found the room deserted. They thereupon assumed that he had gone away somewhere in secret in order to spend a few days in the delightful company of this fair mistress of his, and they gave no further thought to the matter. It was thus that matters stood when on the very next day a local idiot who had strayed into the ruins where the bodies of the prince and Curiaci were lying dragged Curiaci forth by the rope around his neck and started pulling him through the streets. On recognizing who it was, the people were greatly astonished and talked the idiot into leading them to the place from which he had dragged the body, where, to the enormous grief of the whole city, they also found the body of the prince. After burying him with full honors, they took steps to discover who was responsible for this unspeakable crime. And on finding that the Duke of Athens had departed secretly and was nowhere to be found, they rightly concluded that he must be the culprit and that he must have carried off the lady as well. So that, having hastily elected their dead ruler's brother as their new prince, they urged him with all the eloquence of their command to take his revenge. And when further evidence came to light, proving that their suspicions were correct, the prince summoned friends, kinsfolk, and servants from various places to come to his support, and he quickly assembled a huge and powerful army with which he set out to make war on the Duke of Athens. When the Duke received word of the operations, he too mobilized all his armed forces for his defense, and many powerful outsiders came to his assistance, including two who were sent by the Emperor of Constantinople, namely his son Constant and his nephew Manuel. These latter, arriving at the head of large and well-drilled contingents, received a warm welcome from the Duke, but the welcome they received from the Duchess was even warmer, because she was Constant's sister. With the prospect of war becoming daily more imminent, the Duchess chose a convenient moment to invite the two men to her room, where, Talking without stopping amid floods of tears, she told them the whole story, explaining the reasons for the war and exposing the wrong practiced upon her by the Duke on account of this woman, on whose existence he imagined her to be ignorant. Bewailing her lot in no uncertain terms, she begged them, for the sake of the Duke's honor and her own happiness, to take whatever measures they could whatever they could devise for setting matters to rights. The young men were already fully informed about the whole business, and so, without asking too many questions, they consoled her as to the best of their abilities, and gave her every ground for optimism. Then, having discovered from the Duchess where the lady was staying, they took their leave of her. Since they had often heard glowing accounts of this woman's marvelous beauty, they were naturally anxious to see her, and they therefore asked the Duke if he would introduce her to them. The Duke agreed to do so, forgetting the fate which had befallen the prince after granting a similar favor. And the following morning, having ordered a magnificent banquet to be prepared in a beautiful garden on the estate where the lady was living, he took the two men and a handful of other friends to dine with her. On sitting down in their company, Constant began to stare at her in blank amazement, vowing to himself that he had never seen anything so beautiful, and that no one could possibly reproach the Duke or anyone else for resorting to treachery and other dishonest means in order to gain possession of so fair an object. Moreover, his admiration increased with every look he cast in her direction, so that eventually the same thing happened to him as had previously happened to the Duke. And when the time came for him to leave, he was so much in love with her that he dismissed the war completely from his mind and concentrated his thoughts on planning a way of abducting her, at the same time taking good care not to reveal his love to anyone. But whilst he was struggling with his passion, the time arrived for marching against the prince, who by now had almost reached the Duke's territory. Accordingly, at a given signal, the Duke set out from Athens with Constant and all the others, and they took up combat positions along certain stretches of the frontier so as to halt the prince's advance. Constant's thoughts and sentiments continued to focus on the woman, and now that the Duke was no longer near her, he fancied that he had an excellent opportunity for obtaining what he wanted. And so, a few days after their arrival at the frontier, he pretended to be seriously ill so that he would have a pretext for returning to Athens. He then handed over all his powers to Manuel, and with the Duke's permission, he returned to Athens to stay with his sister. A few days later, having steered the conversation round to the sense of injury under which she was laboring on account of the Duke's mistress, he told her that if she so desired, he could be of considerable assistance to her in this affair, and that he could have the woman removed from where she was staying and taken elsewhere. Thinking that Constant was motivated by brotherly love and not by his love for the woman, the Duchess said that she would be only too pleased, provided it could be carried out in such a way that the Duke never discovered that she had given her consent to the scheme. Constant reassured her completely on this point, and accordingly, the Duchess gave him permission to proceed in whatever way he considered best. The first thing he did was to fit out a fast boat in secret, with which one evening, having informed his men on board that what they were to do, he sent to a spot near the garden of the place where the lady was living, and then he went there with another group of men to be amicably received by her retainers, as well as by the lady herself, who at her visitor's suggestion accompanied Constant and his companions into the garden, while her servants trailed along behind, as though he wished to impart some message from the Duke. He then led her off alone in the direction of a gate overlooking the sea, which had already been unlocked by his accomplices. At a given signal, the boat nosed her way inshore. Having had the lady seized and bundled quickly aboard, he turned to her servants, saying, "Unless you want to be killed, don't move or make any sound. It is not my intention to steal the Duke's mistress, but to remove the injury he does to my sister." Since nobody dared offer any reply, Constant embarked with his men and settled himself next to the lady, who was crying, and ordered them to cast off and start rowing. And they plied their oars to such good effect that just before dawn on the following day they arrived in Agana. Going ashore there in order to rest, Constant amused himself in the company of the lady, who was bitterly bewailing her ill-starred beauty. Then they boarded the ship once again, and a few days later they arrived in Chios, where Constant decided to remain, for he thought he would be safe there from his father's strictures and from the possibility of having to surrender the stolen woman. For several days the fair lady bemoaned her misfortune. Eventually, however, she responded to Constance's efforts at consoling her, and began, as on previous occasions, to derive pleasure from the fate to which fortune had consigned her. And this was how matters stood until Uzbek, who was at the time the king of the Turks. There was actually an Uzbek, but he was actually king of the Mongols. Anyway, this is fiction. And who was constantly at war with the emperor, happened to pass through Smyrna, where he learned that Constant was leading a dissolute life on Chios with some stolen mistress of his, leaving himself wide open to attack. Arriving by night with a squadron of light warships, Uzbek quietly entered the town with his men, took numerous people captive from their beds before they were aware of their enemy's arrival, and slaughtered those who had woken up in time to seize their arms. The invaders then set the whole town on fire, and having loaded their booty and prisoners onto the ship, they returned to Smyrna. On reviewing the spoils of the expedition, immediately after their return, Uzbek, who was a young man, was delighted to discover the fair lady, whom he recognized as one who had been taken along with Constant, as she was lying asleep in her bed. So he promptly married her, and after celebrating the nuptials, he happily devoted himself for the next few months to the pleasures of the marriage bed. Now, during the period immediately preceding these happenings, the emperor had been negotiating a pact with the king of Cappadocia, Bassano, whereby the latter was to descend with his forces on Uzbek from one direction, while the emperor attacked with his own troops from the other. He had not yet been able to bring the negotiations to a successful conclusion. However, because of his unwillingness to concede, some were of the more outrageous of Bassano's demands. But on hearing what had happened to his son, he was so incensed that he immediately agreed to the king of Cappadocia's terms and urged him to attack Uzbek as soon as he possibly could. Meanwhile, making his own preparations for marching against him from the opposite direction. When he heard about this, rather than allow himself to be sandwiched between two mighty rulers, Uzbek assembled his army and marched against the king of Cappadocia, leaving his fair lady in Smyrna under the close supervision of a faithful retainer and friend. Some time later, he confronted and engaged the king of Cappadocia, and in the ensuing battle, he was killed, whilst his army was defeated and put to flight. Flushed with victory, Bassano began to advance unopposed on Smyrna, and all the people on his route did homage to him as their conqueror. Meanwhile, the retainer in whose care Uzbek had left his fair lady, Antioco by name, had been so overwhelmed by her beauty that he had betrayed the trust of his friend and master, and although he was getting on in years, he had fallen in love with her. He was familiar with her language, and this pleased her immensely because for several years she had been more or less forced to lead a life of a deaf mute, as she could neither understand what anybody was saying nor make herself understood. With love spurring him on, Antioco began in the first few days to take so many liberties with her that before long they ceased to care about their lord and master, who had gone off soldiering to the wars, and not only did they become good friends, they also became lovers, and as they lay between the sheets, they had a very happy time of it together. But when they heard that Uzbek had been defeated and killed, and that Bassano was on his way there, carrying all before him, they decided with one accord not to wait his arrival. Taking with them a substantial quantity of Uzbek's most valuable possessions, they fled together in secret and came to Rhodes. But they had not been living there very long when Antiocho became mortally ill. With him at that time there happened to be staying a Cypriot merchant, a bosom friend of his, whom he loved dearly, and realizing that his life was drawing to its close, he decided to bequeath his property to him, along with his beloved mistress. And so shortly before he died, he summoned them both to his bedside and said, "I see quite plainly that my strength is failing, which saddens me greatly because life has never been sweeter to me than of late. There is one thing, however, that reconciles me to my fate, for I shall find myself dying, if die I must, in the arms of two people I love best in the whole world. Yours, my dear friend, and those of this woman who I have loved more deeply than I have loved myself for the earliest days of our acquaintance. All the same, it worries me to think when I am gone, she might be left here alone in a strange place with nobody to turn to for help or advice, and I should be all the more worried if it were not for the knowledge of your presence, for I believe that you will cherish her for my sake as tenderly as you would cherish me. In the event of my death, therefore, I commit her and all my property to your charge, and with all my power I entreat you to handle them both in whatever way you think most likely to console my immortal spirit. And I beseech you, dear sweet lady, not to forget me when I am dead, so that in the next world I can claim to be loved in this world by the fairest woman ever fashioned by nature. Promise me faithfully that you will carry out these two requests of mine, and I shall undoubtedly die contented." As they listened to these words, both the lady and his merchant friend shed many a tear. When he had finished speaking, they soothed him and gave him their word of honor that in the event of his death, they would do so as he had asked. Very soon afterwards, he passed away, and they saw that he was given an honorable funeral. A few days later, having completed all his business in Rhodes, being desirous of taking ship on a Catalan carrack that was about to sail for Cyprus, the Cypriot merchant inquired of the fair lady what she was proposing to do, telling her that for his part he was compelled to return to Cyprus. The lady said that if he had no objection, she would gladly accompany him, because she had hoped that out of his affection for Antiocho, he would treat and regard her as a sister. The merchant assured her of his willingness to do whatever she asked, and with the object of protecting her from any harm that might befall her, before they reached Cyprus, he passed her off as his wife. Having embarked on the ship, therefore, they were assigned to a small cabin on the poop deck, and in order to maintain appearances, he bedded down with her in the same narrow little bunk. What happened next was something that neither of them had bargained for when leaving Rhodes, because, what with the darkness and the enforced idleness and the warmth of the bed, all of which are powerful stimulants, they were each consumed with an almost equally intense longing, and without sparing a thought for the love and friendship they owed to the dead Antiocho, they began to excite each other, with the result that by the time they reached the Cypriot home port of Paphos, they had become husband and wife in good earnest. And for some time after their arrival at Paphos, they lived together in the merchant's house. Now it happened that there came to Paphos on some business or other a gentleman called Antigono, who was old in years, even older in wisdom. He was not a very rich man, because although he had undertaken numerous commissions in the service of the king of Cyprus, fortune had never been particularly kind to him. One day, as he was walking past the house where the fair lady was living, at a time when the Cypriot merchant was away on a trading mission in Armenia, Antigono happened to catch sight of the lady at one of the windows. Since she was very beautiful, he began to stare at her, and it occurred to him that he had seen her on some previous occasion. But try as he would, he could not remember where. For a long time now, the fair lady had been a plaything in the hands of fortune. But the moment was approaching when her trials would be over. When she espied Antigono, she recalled having seen him in Alexandria, where he once occupied a position of some importance in her father's service. Knowing that her merchant was away and being suddenly filled with the hope that there might be some possibility of returning once more to her regal status, with the help of this man's advice, she sent for him at the earliest opportunity. And when he called upon her, she shyly asked whether she was right in thinking him to be Antigono of Famagusta. Antigono said that he was, adding, "I have an idea, ma'am, that I have seen you before, but I cannot for the life of me remember where. Pray be good enough, therefore, if you have no objection, to remind me who you are." On hearing that this was indeed the man she had assumed him to be, the lady burst into tears and threw her arms around his neck, and presently she asked her highly astonished visitor whether he had ever seen her in Alexandria. No sooner had she put the question to Antigono than Antigono recognized her as the Sultan's daughter, Alatil, whom everybody believed to be drowned at sea, and he prepared to make her the ceremonial bow that she was due, but she would not allow this, and asked him instead to come and sit down with her for a while. Complying, Antigono asked her in reverential tones how, when, and whence she had come to Cyprus, and told her that the whole Egyptian nation had been convinced for many years that she had been drowned at sea. "I wish to goodness they were right," said the lady, "and I think my father should share my opinion if he were ever to discover the sort of life I have lived." And so saying, she started crying prodigiously all over again, whereupon Antigono said to her, "My lady, it is too soon for you to go upsetting yourself like this. Tell me about your misfortunes, if you like, and about the life you have been living. Possibly we shall find that the point has been reached where we shall be able, with God's help, to devise some sort of happy outcome to your dilemma." "Antigono," the fair lady replied, "the other day when I first saw you, it was as if I was seeing my own father. Prompted by the love and tenderness that I have an obligation to bear him, I revealed my presence to you when I could have remained concealed. Yours is the first familiar face I've encountered for many years, and there are few people I could possibly be so contented to see. To you, therefore, as though you were my father, I shall reveal the story of my appalling misfortunes, which I have never related to anyone before. If, when you have heard what I have to say, you see any possibility of restoring me to my former state, I beseech you to explore it. If not, I must ask you never to tell a living soul that you have either seen me or heard anything about me." And so saying, never ceasing to weep, she told him about everything that had happened to her since the day on which she was shipwrecked off Majorca. Whereupon Antigono too began to weep with compassion, and after considering the matter at some length, he said, "My lady, since your identity has remained a secret throughout the course of your misadventures, I shall have no difficulty in restoring you to a higher place than ever in your father's affection, and you will then go to marry the King of Algarve, as originally arranged." When she inquired how it was to be managed, he explained to her in detail what she was to do, and to avoid all further delay and any further complications, Antigono returned at once to Famagusta and went to see the king, addressing him thus: "My lord, if it pleases you, you can at the same time cover yourself with glory and render a most valuable service to one who has grown poor while acting on your behalf. I refer, of course, to myself." The king asked him to explain, and Antigono replied, "The fair young daughter of the Sultan, who was long reputed to have been drowned at sea, has arrived in Paphos. For many years she has endured extreme hardship in the struggle to preserve her honor. She has been reduced to comparative poverty, and she wishes to return to her father. If you were to send her back to the Sultan under my escort, it would redound greatly to your credit, and I would be sure of a rich reward. It is unlikely, moreover, that the Sultan will ever forget your charitable deed." His regal magnanimity having been stirred, the king readily gave his consent, and he dispatched a guard of honor to accompany the lady to Famagusta, where he and the queen welcomed her amid the scenes of indescribable rejoicing and magnificent pomp and splendor. And when she was asked by the king and the queen to tell them about her adventures, she replied exactly as she had been instructed by Antigone. A few days later, at her request, the king sent her back to the Sultan under the guardianship of Antigone, providing her with a distinguished retinue of fine gentlemen and ladies-in-waiting. And needless to say, the Sultan gave her a tremendous welcome, which she extended also to Antigone and the whole of her retinue. After she had rested for a while, the Sultan demanded to know how it came about that she was still alive, where she had been living all this time, and why she had never sent word of what she was doing. Remembering Antigone's instructions to the tiniest detail, the lady then addressed her father as follows: "Father, some 20 days after my departure, our ship was disabled by a raging tempest and ran aground at night on the shores of the western Mediterranean, near a place called Aguismortes. I never discovered what happened to all the men who were in the ship. All I can remember is that when the dawn arrived, I truly felt as if I was rising from the dead. The local people had already espied the wreckage and came running from miles around in order to plunder it. I was put ashore with 2 of my maidservants, who were instantly snatched by young men and carried off in different directions. And that was the last I saw or heard of them. I myself, after putting out stout resistance, was overpowered by 2 young men and hauled away by my tresses, weeping bitterly all the time. But just as they crossed a road in order to drag me into a thick forest, 4 men happened to pass that way on horseback, and when my captors saw them coming, they instantly let me go and took to their heels. On seeing this, the 4 men, who, to judge from their appearance, seemed to hold positions of authority, rode swiftly up and asked me a lot of questions, to which I gave many answers, but it was impossible to make ourselves understood. After talking together for some little while, they took me up to one of their houses and conducted me to a convent of nuns who practiced these men's religion. I do not know what it was that they said to the nuns, but at any rate I was kindly received by everybody, and I was always treated with great respect. Whilst there, I joined them in the reverent worship of Saint Stephen in the Hollows. This is actually a real saint, to whom the women in the country are deeply devoted. But after staying with them for some time and acquiring a discreet knowledge of their language, I was asked who I was and where I had come from. Knowing where I was, I feared to tell them the truth, lest they should expel me as an enemy of their religion. And so I replied that I was the daughter of a fine nobleman of Cyprus, who was sending me to be married in Crete, when we were driven by a storm onto those shores and shipwrecked. For fear of meeting a worse fate, I imitated their customs regularly in various ways. Eventually, I was asked by the oldest of these women, whom the others referred to as the abbess, whether I wished to return to Cyprus, and I replied that there was nothing I desired more. However, being concerned for my honor, she was unwilling to entrust me to anyone coming to Cyprus until about 2 months ago, when a certain French gentleman, some of them related to the abbess, arrived with their wives, and when she heard that they were going to Jerusalem to visit the sepulchre, where the man they look upon as God was buried after being killed by the Jews, she placed me under their care and asked them to hand me over to my father on reaching Cyprus. It would take too long to describe how greatly I was honored and how warmly I was welcomed by these noblemen and their wives. Suffice it to say that we all took ship, and that several days later we reached Paphos, where I found myself facing a dilemma, because there was nobody there who knew me, and I had no idea what to say to these gentlemen who were anxious to carry out the venerable lady's instructions and hand me over to my father. However, it was all the will of Allah, who was possibly feeling sorry for me, that just as we stepped ashore at Paphos, Antigone should be standing on the quayside. I promptly called out to him using our own language, so that neither the gentleman nor their wives would follow what I was saying. I told him to welcome me as his daughter. He promptly complied, making a tremendous fuss of me, and strained his modest resources to the limit in ensuring that those noblemen and their ladies were suitably entertained. He afterwards conveyed me to the King of Cyprus, and I could never adequately describe how honorably I was received, or how much trouble the king took in returning me to you here in Alexandria. And now, if there's anything else that remains to be said, let it be told by Antigona, to whom I have recounted the story of my adventures over and over again. My lord, said Antigona, turning to the Sultan, her story corresponds in every detail with the account she has given me on many occasions, as well as with assurances I received from the noblemen of whose company she came to Cyprus. One thing only she has refrained from mentioning because it would not have been appropriate for her to do so. I shall tell you what it is. Those good people who brought her to Cyprus paid glowing tributes to the honest life she had led while living with the nuns. They were full of praise for her virtues and excellent character. And when the time came for them to commit her to my charge, they bid her a fond farewell. They all, gentlemen and ladies alike, burst into floods of tears. Were I to provide you with the full account of what they said to me on this particular subject, I could go on talking all day and all night without coming to the end of it. I trust, however, that these few remarks will suffice to convince you that, as their words showed, and as I have been able to observe for myself, no other living monarch can claim to possess such a beautiful, virtuous, and courageous daughter. The Sultan was absolutely delighted to hear these tidings and prayed repeatedly that Allah would grant him an opportunity to make proper restitution to those who had done honor to his daughter, in particular the King of Cyprus, who had restored her to him in such splendid style. A few days later, having ordered sumptuous presents to be prepared for Antigona, he gave him leave to return to Cyprus, and at the same time dispatching letters and special envoys to convey his heartfelt thanks to the king for the favors he had bestowed upon his daughter. Then, finally, since it was his wish to make an end of what was begun, or in other words, that she should become the King of Algarve's wife, he wrote informing him of all that had happened, adding that if he still desired to marry her, he should send his envoys to fetch her. The King of Algarve was delighted with these tidings, sent a suitably distinguished party to act as her escort, and upon her arrival he gave her a joyous welcome, and so, despite the fact that 8 separate men had made love to her on thousands of different occasions, she entered his bed as a virgin, and convinced him that it was really so. And for many years afterwards she lived a contented life as his queen. Hence the proverbial saying, a kissed mouth doesn't lose its freshness. Like the moon, it turns up new again. And that's the end of that story. Wow. Bye-bye.